In the great Mexica capital of Tenochtitlan, a priest acting as the Tlamacatqui prepares an offering for the dedication of the great temple of the city, the Huey Teocalli, what we today know as the Templo Mayor. Enriched by conquest and the blessings of the gods, the temple has been continuously expanded and refurbished to reflect the splendor of the Mexica and their growing power across the land. Surrounded by Mexica, Acolwa, and Tepanec nobles, the priest sings to the gods, beseeching their continued favor and blessings on their great city. A small hole has been dug into the dark earth, and the priest begins arranging various objects: pots of libations, precious shells and stones, and small statuettes. One object in particular holds his attention. It's a small mask finely carved from jade with an upturned lip and a cleft top. The Tlamakatskwi knows that this is not the work of one of the city's artists or craftsmen. If the face could speak, it would tell of a golden age that faded long ago. It would speak of a master and maker long lost to memory and an ancient abode now covered by the endless cycles of time. Its long journey gives the heirloom a special power now inherited by the Mexica. As the Tlamakatskwi places it among the other objects, he hopes that the gods of these ancient masters will look upon the Mexica favorably and protect their temple and their city. The empty eyes stare into the sky, and the polished jade reflects the bright rays of the sun before the cache is solemnly buried in the earth. This evocative scene is inspired by a real Olmec artifact that was recovered from a cache at the base of the Templo Mayor in Mexico City in the 20th century. Much of the scene is my own embellishment, and I hope you'll forgive my poetic license, but it speaks to the incredible long lived legacy of the Olmecs in Mesoamerica. In our previous episode, we explored the rise of the Olmec, and today we return to the Olmec at their cultural zenith. This was a time of change across Mesoamerica as societies all over became more sophisticated and complex, and the Olmec played an important role in the region's development. They set important precedents in art, politics, and religion that would persist for centuries. Although we can't know with certainty what later cultures knew or thought about the Olmecs, I think we can safely speculate that they still admired that legacy thousands of years later. And at the end of this episode, I think you will too. Just a quick refresher on chronology for this episode. We are in the formative period of Mesoamerican history, which is divided into three units: the early, middle, and late formative periods. In part one, we covered the early formative period, and if you haven't watched that, I highly recommend watching that video before this. For this episode, we'll be looking at developments in the middle and late formative periods. When we concluded the previous episode, we discussed San Lorenzo's decline and eventual abandonment, so let's pick up there. Just as a reminder for those who have already forgotten the previous episode, this decline isn't fully understood, but appears to have been related to changes in subsistence, rising political turmoil, and from changes in the natural river systems. I mentioned that the Coatzacoalcos and San Juan basins were largely abandoned around 1000 BCE, and that people were migrating out of the region. Perhaps the most important destination for many of these people lay to the east, where a grand new city was taking shape that would leave a huge impact on Mesoamerica. That site was La Venta. Now, La Venta was originally founded around 1400 BCE on a small salt dome island in the Tonalá River drainage, about 13 kilometers from the coast. Like San Lorenzo, this gave it access to river trade, but also to coastal trade and marine resources as well. The early centuries of the site are poorly understood, but by 1150 BCE, there's evidence of an emerging elite using pottery inspired by San Lorenzo styles. When the Olmecs began to abandon the Coatzacoalcos Basin, the Tonalá Basin proved to be a popular destination. San Lorenzo's loss was La Venta's gain, and it began to swell with new migrants. At 800 BCE, it was among the premier cities in Mesoamerica, covering about 150 to 200 hectares. San Lorenzo had sustained itself on a mixed approach of cultivated crops and riverine animals like fish, turtles, and shellfish. While these riverine animals were also available at La Venta, maize farming was becoming more and more important. Archaeologists have noted that maize farming really scaled up after 1150 BCE and became the staple crop of the city and its hinterlands. Another way that we can see the new importance of maize is its role in maize iconography. To be clear, maize symbolism had existed at San Lorenzo, but it exploded in the Olmec world during the Middle Formative period. Because much of the site has been lost to development, population estimates are difficult to make. Robert Heitzer estimated that La Venta and its hinterland likely had a population of around 18,000 people. Now, I want to make it clear that not everyone in the Coatzacoalcos and San Juan basins packed up and headed to La Venta. Other options were available. Many struck out west to the Tuxtla Piedmont, and during the beginning of the Middle Formative period, the population increased pretty dramatically. After 1000 BCE, several new villages appeared, such as Tres Zapotes and Cerro de las Mesas. These sites are fascinating, but they never gained the power and prestige of La Venta, despite their impressive growth. We'll circle back to them later, and for now, let's return to La Venta. Please note that the map is oriented to the side. Everyone always complains, but let me tell you, it's way easier to show the site this way than aligning north to the top of the screen. Investigation at La Venta has been complicated by a few factors. First, a chunk of the site was destroyed and covered by sprawl after Pemex built an oil processing plant there in the 1950s. This industrial activity damaged a lot of the site, and work crews moved several monuments, which destroyed their archaeological context. Thankfully, the Mexican government took important steps to preserve the site, and it's in much better shape now than it was 60 years ago. Also, archaeologists have had a lot of difficulties calibrating radiocarbon dates recovered at the site, which means that we lack the fine chronology like the ones that we had at San Lorenzo, so it can be a bit difficult to know exactly which buildings and features were built in what order. That said, there's still a lot to appreciate about La Venta. Most of the city center survives, and it shows us how Olmec urban design had dramatically changed from what we saw at San Lorenzo. La Venta's layout is more formally planned, aligned on an axis of 8 degrees west of north. The center stretches for nearly a kilometer and a half and contains over 30 earthen mounds and platforms. The buildings are divided into various complexes that are designated A through I. With that said, let's take a little tour of La Venta. The complexes at the north and south ends of the city center are complexes D and I, and these were likely the formal entryways into the city center. Complex I includes 3 of La Venta's 4 colossal heads, which likely greeted visitors to the city's northern entrance. At the heart of the city is the Great Pyramid. This divides the city center into 2 segments, a northern sacred sector and a southern secular or public sector. Though badly eroded today, the pyramid measures 128 by 144 meters at the base and over 30 meters high and has a volume of almost 100,000 cubic meters. It would have been the largest pyramid in Mesoamerica when it was constructed. The original shape was debated for decades by archaeologists. One popular theory was that the fluted top of the pyramid was originally modeled to represent a volcano, like those in the Tuxtla Mountains. A cool idea for sure, but excavations in the 1990s confirmed that it was originally a stepped pyramid. The pyramid appears to have had a building on top, but it's difficult to say much beyond that because back in the 1960s, 2 meters were bulldozed off the top, destroying most of the archaeological remains at the summit. To the south of the Great Pyramid is Complex B. This has 4 large mounds around a plaza that measures 42,000 square meters, lots of space for crowds to view public ceremonies. One colossal head and several thrones were recovered from the plaza. To the east is the Stirling Acropolis, a massive platform mound named after the famous archaeologist Matthew Stirling, who excavated several Olmec sites. Based on the recovery of basalt columns and drainage lines, this was likely the site of the city's royal palace compound. To the south, Complex D contains the southern entrance that we mentioned earlier, but also has many other smaller mounds and plazas. The mounds likely held elite residences and sacred buildings on top. It's worth mentioning that Complex D has an early example of an E group, a common architectural complex often found in formative cities and settlements. Older literature will claim that this is the first E group from which all others in Mesoamerica descend, but recent investigations by Takeshi Inomata have cast some doubt on this. The site of Sebal in the Maya region, which dates to 950 BCE, has a simple E group that predates most of the construction at La Venta. Rather than being a cut and dry instance of Olmec invention influencing Mesoamerica, the picture's more complex. This is likely an instance where the Olmec were adopting ideas from beyond their homeland. The most important complex, however, is Complex A. This was the elite ceremonial core of the city, and excavations have revealed some incredible discoveries. Complex A was not a public space, but one that was reserved for the royalty and elites, and it's where many rulers and their families were buried in splendor. From north to south, the complex consists of two parallel mounds, with a smaller mound in between. North of them are a series of smaller platforms surrounding a ceremonial court. Much of this area was enclosed with large basalt columns to close it off from public sight. I would propose that this is the America's first stone privacy fence, but I can't prove that. On a serious note, many scholars have proposed that this complex's design is meant to be a model of the Olmec cosmos, with the Great Pyramid symbolizing Sustenance Mountain, the source of maize and water, as well as the site of human creation in several Mesoamerican mythologies. The line of stelae replete with maize imagery may have symbolized the world tree or axis mundi. This ceremonial and sacred landscape of Complex A and the pyramid would have given the Olmec elites a fitting stage to reenact and celebrate the creation of the world and other mythological events. The tombs of Complex A are among the richest tombs from the formative period, certainly the richest among the Olmec. One tomb, Tomb A, was constructed with walls and a roof made from large basalt columns. Although the bodies in the tomb disintegrated long ago thanks to the acidic tropical soils, many of the grave goods have survived, including sets of exquisitely carved jadeite objects, stingray spines, shell artifacts, beads, a polished magnetite mirror, and a seated female figure with a tiny pendant mirror on her chest. Those stingray spines also imply that bloodletting rituals were a feature of Olmec religion, which was a common practice in later Mesoamerican religions. Tomb B had a massive sarcophagus carved from sandstone with a were-jaguar face, but again, the body of its occupant has not survived. Complex A also has several buried offerings that scholars call massive offerings due to their wealth and scale. More so than the tombs, these truly showcase the power of La Venta's rulers. These were placed into pits lined with serpentine and blue-green clay. One of the most famous massive offerings contains 1,000 tons of serpentine blocks in 28 layers with a beautiful mosaic floor. The design of this mosaic has been proposed as a highly stylized were-jaguar or an Olmec dragon, or even a representation of the Olmec cosmos. This was truly extravagant. The amount of serpentine represented in that offering alone represented a mind boggling amount of wealth, which is all the more striking when you remember that this mosaic wasn't made for the floor of a home or a palace. It was an offering to the gods, and after it was assembled and arranged, it was buried, never to be seen again until the 20th century. I can only imagine the taxpayers freaking out about this kind of wasteful spending. Another famous offering is a small dedicatory offering called Offering 4. This offering was left in a hole dug into a plaza floor, and it contains a dramatic scene. In this assemblage, 16 people stand upright in a circle with several carved jade celts on one side like stelae. 10 of the figures stand in a semicircle, observing 4 figures approaching a central character made of highly polished jade. Many scholars believe that this represents an Olmec ceremony that may have taken place within the sacred complex, but there's no way to know for sure. It's certainly the kind of thing you want to be true. Interestingly enough, this offering appears to have been remembered by the Olmec, because excavations showed that when it was originally buried, it was covered in sand and then buried under a mound. About a century later, someone dug a precise shaft down to the offering and exposed the top before reburying them. It's as if someone wanted to check in and make sure that everyone was still there. Pretty neat. As incredible as Complex A is, La Venta's monuments cover the entire site. These monuments tend to be bigger than those of San Lorenzo and reflect a greater ability of its rulers to mobilize labor. The monuments were arranged in complexes and plazas as part of a civic landscape that was imbued with special meaning. It's worth looking at these to contrast them with what we saw at San Lorenzo. Early monuments appear to be carved in the round, similar to monuments at San Lorenzo. A good example are the four colossal heads that likely depicted rulers. Another fine example that isn't from La Venta but is believed to date from this time is the wrestler who's portrayed in this dynamic pose. The Olmec also carved thrones, or altars as they're sometimes labeled, and these are some of the finest examples of thrones in the Olmec corpus. Altar 4 in particular is usually singled out as a splendid piece. Like the ones we saw earlier, this throne features a ruler emerging from a cave or maw, grasping at a rope bound to a captive on the other side of the throne. To the sides are stylized ears of maize. Above in the upper register is a representation of the earth monster. All of these elements likely alluded to Olmec mythology or cosmology. To those of you saying, big deal, we've seen all this before, please hold your booze until the end because the artists of La Venta innovated new kinds of art. We've seen examples of beautiful figures already in Complex A, and others have been recovered from La Venta as well. Another likely innovation during this time are Olmec masks. These are some of the finest works of Olmec artists. Some depict natural human faces, but others incorporate were-jaguar and bird monster faces. Some even have designs painted or incised into them. How these were used is a topic of much debate, and you'll often see the term ritual or ceremony attached to them. Judging from the holes drilled into many of their sides, these could have been worn on a face, worn on a necklace, or hung elsewhere as decoration. Unfortunately, almost every Olmec mask was discovered by looters, and we lack important context, so it's difficult to say exactly how they were used. The most famous source of these masks is probably Arroyo Pesquero near La Venta, which was probably an Olmec ritual site. It's hard to say because looters basically ransacked the site for decades and smuggled hundreds of jade celts, figurines, and masks to antiquities dealers who shipped them all over the world before archaeologists were able to investigate and salvage what little remained. Perhaps the most important development in Olmec art, however, comes from the use of relief carving. Over the course of La Venta's history, relief carving began to take precedence in monuments over freestanding sculpture. This led artists and elites to embrace a new medium, the stela. Some of these stelae are described as celtiform because they are long and narrow like earlier jade celts. Even the carved designs are similar to those on celts and often depict subjects like were-jaguars or supernatural masks. The most famous stelae, however, have full narrative scenes. One of my favorite examples is Stela 2 from La Venta. This stela has a central figure clad in a cape and headdress, holding a ceremonial bar. They are surrounded by 6 supernatural floating figures. On another stela, Stela 3, 2 figures also clad in elaborate headdresses face each other flanked by floating figures. For those of you familiar with your Mesoamerican history and lore, you know that stelae are going to become a very important category of monuments during the Classic period. These developments parallel a new feature in Olmec religion, the cult of the ruler. To be clear, this had its roots back in the early formative, but it really blossomed in the middle formative at La Venta. Over the course of Olmec history, religion became more formalized, and it's believed that full-time priests and rulers began to play a role in Olmec religion alongside the shamans that we mentioned in the last episode. Rulers likely fulfilled important religious positions and may have been seen as important mediators between the gods and their subjects. In fact, it's likely that this was an important aspect of the cult of the ruler, though it's impossible to know the exact nature of their relationship to the gods. While we're on the subject of religious developments, we also see a new but familiar deity in the Olmec pantheon, the feathered serpent. The best example of this comes from La Venta Monument 19. This monument depicts a rattlesnake with a plumed crest and a human with a helmet and cape nestled in its coil. Although feathered serpents feature prominently in later Mesoamerican religions, the rarity of the feathered serpent in Olmec iconography has led scholars to believe that at this time it was a minor deity. Whether the feathered serpent was truly new, his depiction is one of the many artistic and cultural innovations of the later Olmec. But back to those stelae. These kind of narrative stelae show that Olmec elites were increasingly interested in recording historical events, so it shouldn't be a coincidence that we see early elements of writing in the Olmen. The Olmec are often credited as the inventors of writing in Mesoamerica, and there's some merit to this notion. Venta does indeed have some of the earliest plausible evidence of writing. First, let's direct our attention to Monument 13. This monument shows a walking bearded figure next to three glyph like symbols, perhaps symbolizing a name or a place. To his left is a footprint, which is very interesting because later Aztec codices use footprints to denote travel. Are these symbols examples of writing? Maybe, maybe not. We can't say for sure. In my opinion, it doesn't look like a later Mesoamerican text. But a better example comes from the nearby site of San Andreas. A cylinder seal excavated from the site and dated to 700 to 500 BCE contains a bird that appears to have glyphs emanating from its beak, as if it's speaking. It's worth noting that one of these glyphs has also been discovered on a small sculpture found in the Soconusco, so at least one of the symbols is not an isolated example. There are also a few Olmec masks that have glyphs on them, but these were all looted, so it's impossible to say how old they are. Because these examples are so few, it's difficult to say if these are examples of a writing script or symbols denoting something else. But I think it's fair to say that the Olmec appear to have been experimenting with new methods of representation that may have contributed to the development of writing. For the record, the oldest securely dated, undisputed examples of writing come from the Valley of Oaxaca between 750 and 500 BCE. So there's a strong case to be made that the first writing actually came from the Zapotecs. San Jose Magote Monument 3 dates to the same period, and unlike the Olmec examples, there's no dispute that it has a legible date and name glyph. Again, it really comes down to whether or not you consider those Olmec examples as true writing, and there's a lot of debate about this. But ancient Americas, I hear you chant, what about the Cascajal block? Ah, yes, the Cascajal block. So, for some background, this block was discovered in 1998 or 1999 by local road builders, and it contains what appear to be many glyphs. I should note that this was not excavated, so it's difficult to determine the exact archaeological context of the block, but its date is cautiously estimated around 900 BCE based on wider context. If it is a legitimate example of a Mesoamerican script, this would make it the earliest instance of writing in the Americas. However, the Cascajal block is a bit controversial, and while it does have many prominent supporters like Stephen Houston, Carl Taub, and William Saturno, to name a few, it also has prominent skeptics such as David Grove and Christopher Poole, among others. You can feel free to disagree with me here and let me know why in the comments, but to amateur and uncredentialed me, this does not look like Maya, Zapotec, or Epi-Olmec scripts we see later in Mesoamerica. I'm not saying it's a hoax or anything, but it could be the product of an artist practicing his carving. It's not written in standard rows or columns, and there's no accompanying visual scene that it captions, and it's a completely isolated example. If we had more examples of this script from better contexts, I would warm up to this. So whether the Olmec adapted a script from other cultures or developed one on their own is still an ongoing debate. Speaking of other cultures, let's take a look at the Olmec role in wider Mesoamerica. As we mentioned in the last episode, the Olmec traded for exotic goods such as greenstone, shells, obsidian, iron ores, amber, and mica. What's interesting, though, is that Olmec style art appears in many areas outside the Olmen, in areas such as the Mexican highlands, the Soconusco, and parts of modern Guatemala and El Salvador. We mentioned in the previous episode that Olmec motifs show up in pottery outside the Olmen. By the Middle Formative, these began to be replaced by and augmented with local symbols and motifs. This also accompanied growing sophistication in societies beyond the Olmen. More and more societies were becoming centralized and hierarchical. They were coming into their own and engaging with their peers and the Olmec. These cultures took inspiration from the Olmec and borrowed many of their symbols and styles in expressing their own ideas and objectives. So let's take a not so brief tour around Mesoamerica to get an idea of this, starting with the Soconusco and checking in on the Mochaya from the last episode. Scholars refer to an Olmecization of Mochaya culture, where Mochaya leaders increasingly relied on Olmec motifs to display their authority. Remember, the Mochaya likely spoke a Mishe-Zokian language related to the Olmec's own language, and they had relations going back to the early formative, so this shouldn't be too surprising. The famous Mokai site of La Blanca grew after 1000 BCE and featured a large 25-meter tall pyramid like that of La Venta, as well as Olmec style sculptures. Another good example is the formative site of Takalikaba, which has the distinction of having the only colossal head outside the Olmen, although it's not much to look at now since it was in the process of being recarved. Another well known Middle formative site is the site of Chiapa de Corzo, which came to prominence after 700 BCE as a vital trade link between the Olmen and the Soconusco. A large cache of Olmec artifacts was discovered at the base of one of its mounds. This shows that there was a lot of interaction between the southeast and the Olmec. To the west, Guerrero and Puebla produced some truly astonishing Olmec style art, especially in portable stone art and ceramic sculpture. Dare I say, it is a veritable gold mine of Olmec artifacts. Unfortunately, most of these portable pieces were looted, so it's difficult to say much about where and when these came from. However, the most famous artworks from Guerrero are mercifully unlootable because they are rock murals. At Huxlahuaca, a beautiful mural depicts a large figure wearing a cape over a striped tunic with jaguar patterned arm and leg coverings. He holds a rope that appears to be tied to a smaller figure, likely a captive, similar to what we saw on Altar 4 at La Venta. No less brilliant are the murals from Axtotitlan. Mural 1 shows a man dressed in a costume with an owl face mask sitting on top of an Olmec throne that depicts a zoomorphic creature. We mentioned this mural briefly in the previous episode because this is why most scholars believe that the so called altars are actually thrones. Other murals depict jaguars, serpents, and humans in middle formative style. Another important site in Guerrero is the site of Teopantecuantitlan. This site is famous for its sunken courtyard and for the fact that it has the earliest irrigation canal in Mesoamerica, but we're going to focus on the courtyard. This was originally built at the end of the early formative period, but it was expanded during the middle formative, which is why I've saved it for this episode. During this expansion, 4 large T-shaped travertine blocks were cut and carved with faces in typical Olmec style, with the trademark downturned mouth and almond-shaped eyes. Each wears a headband with a crossband motif, and they clutch a feather bundle or torch. What these faces represent is a bit debated. Common suggestions are that they represent the Olmec maize god, sacred mountains at the 4 corners of the earth, the Olmec earth monster, or an amalgamation of all of these. Perhaps the most famous Olmec-inspired artwork, however, comes from the site of Chalcatzinco. This site could be its own episode, so please note that I'm criminally condensing a lot in this brief overview. Chalcatzingo is in the state of Morelos, and it's a geographically stunning location at the base of 2 towering granodiorite hills. The site contains a settlement that has about 30 stone carvings on a series of monuments, organized into groups of different cosmological themes within a sacred space on the slope of the hills. These can't be directly dated, but based on the style, they are believed to date from between 800 to 450 BCE. Speaking of the style, these are so Olmec in their execution that some archaeologists have suggested that these were carved by artists from La Venta itself. Now, we can't cover all these carvings, so we're only going to hit the top ones. The most famous monument is Monument 1, also called El Rey. This work features a seated figure in a headdress inside a niche holding a ceremonial box. Wind or vapor escape from the niche, and above the scene we see clouds and raindrops falling as vegetation blooms below. The figure appears to be summoning rain from the heavens, and some have speculated that the rulers of Chalcatzinco may have claimed to have had this power. Scholars have noted similarities to the vegetation and rain imagery from altars 4 and 5 from La Venta. Also, the niche is actually part of a quatrefoil that's used in other monuments at the site to depict the earth monster, which you can see an example of here. Monument 2 also gives us an image of 3 figures in procession, while a 4th sits on the ground, perhaps struck down. Other monuments show supernatural felines and other creatures attacking humans. All of these are done in a very Olmec style and show Chalcatzingo's close links with sites like Teopantecuantitlan, Axtotitlan, Huxlahuaca, and La Venta. Pulling back, we can see that there's a strong Olmec influence across Mesoamerica, but we need to be careful how we interpret this. No scholars that I'm aware of believe that these are traces of an Olmec empire or some sort of Olmec imposed order. As I mentioned earlier, the Middle Formative Period saw many societies across Mesoamerica become increasingly centralized as elites rose to prominence. And such developments were not the result of Olmec coaching. We shouldn't think of these middle formative cultures as cultural scavengers feasting on the crumbs of the Olmecs, but instead as peers of the Olmecs that were able to pursue their own interests and project their own power. In this environment, the Olmec were still power players who were able to acquire and work exotic goods, as seen in the La Venta caches and offerings from earlier. Such exchange would have facilitated the building of relationships and alliances across Mesoamerica, and variations of Olmec style art across Mesoamerica reflect this complex interaction. However, as their neighbors became increasingly organized, they may have begun to outcompete Olmec elites for influence, prestige, and exotic materials. That success may have helped usher the decline of the Olmec. Let's turn back to La Venta to look at this in more detail. The Olmec decline coincides with the closure of the Middle Formative Period at 400 BCE. By that year, Mesoamerican interaction with La Venta and the wider Olmen was in steep decline. La Venta's decline is poorly understood. Archaeologists can confidently say that by 400 BCE, the city and its hinterland were abandoned. Studies by geomorphologists have shown that some of the rivers had changed course, and this may have hampered La Venta's ability to trade with its neighbors. Political and cultural decline have also been proposed, but this is difficult to prove. I will point out that the elites of La Venta may have known that the end was nigh, because rather than leaving Complex A exposed, they deliberately buried the entire complex in a 30-centimeter thick cap of red clay, in either a brilliant display of foresight or a very coincidental act of closure. What's interesting, though, is that the decline of La Venta coincides with the abandonment of all of its hinterland, and this area remained virtually uninhabited until the 20th century. Whatever happened, it was enough to send nearly everyone packing to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Now, it'd be easy to say that Olmec culture had run its course and then wrap up this episode, but cultures rarely just end abruptly. If we look to other parts of the Olmen and to Mesoamerica as a whole, we can see a larger transition playing out during the late formative period. Although Olmec culture had ceased, we find some interesting final gasps in two areas: the Tuxtlas and in southeastern Mesoamerica. The southeast, as we saw earlier, had close links to the Olmec, and they carried on and developed much of that tradition. The most important site here is Izapa, which continued and developed the region's Olmec inspired monumental tradition. The site has almost 90 stelae and 3 colossal thrones, all Olmec staples, but their style is very different. Rather than being decorated in that Olmec narrative style, they are decorated in a very detailed Baroque style that leaves very little empty space, and these scenes tend to focus on mythological or religious scenes rather than the rulers themselves. Some of these monuments also have glyphs carved into them. Izapan's style would inspire artists and elites at several other cities in the Guatemalan highlands, like Takalikaba, El Baul, and Kaminalhuyu. But now let's return to the Olmen, specifically to the Tuxtlas. As we mentioned at the start of this episode, this area had grown during the Middle Formative period, and several important Olmec settlements were formed. During the early and Middle Formative periods, these were Olmec sites through and through. After La Venta's fall, many of these grew but were not practicing the same Olmec culture of yore. Their culture is better described as an Olmec inspired transitional culture that would eventually become the classic Veracruz culture, which would dominate the region during the upcoming Classic period. Scholars refer to this as Epi-Olmec culture, literally post Olmec culture. To get a better look at Epi-Olmec culture and its achievements, we're going to focus primarily on the best research site from this area and period, Tres Zapotes. Habitation at Tres Zapotes goes back to the early formative. During that period, it was a small hamlet and didn't achieve regional prominence until 900 to 800 BCE, when it expanded to cover about 80 hectares with several other hamlets and villages. Despite this relatively small size, it was never under San Lorenzo's or La Venta's domination, and appears to have charted its own course, like many Olmec settlements beyond the hinterland of the great cities. Now, Tres Zapotes sometimes gets listed next to San Lorenzo and La Venta in the literature, but it never achieved their brilliance, though it's worth noting that the elite at the site were able to commission two colossal heads during the Middle Formative. Even today, those heads remain the two largest monuments ever produced at the site. Monument A has the distinction of being the first colossal head discovered, as we mentioned in the previous episode. Those earlier monuments aside, Tres Zapotes' best days were still on the horizon. Archaeology has shown that after 400 BCE, the city expanded from 80 to 500 hectares, likely as a result of immigration from the west after Laventa's fall, though it's worth pointing out that this expansion would have only represented a small amount of the total population that left Laventa and its hinterland. Many of those people must have migrated elsewhere after Laventa's decline. For those that did resettle in Tres Zapotes, they would have found a place with a mild climate and fertile, moist soils well suited to maize agriculture. Even with this influx, Tres Zapotes nor any of its Epi-Olmec contemporaries ever achieved the size and sophistication that La Venta possessed. If we look at the city's layout, there's no central design. Instead of a main plaza and exclusive elite spaces, there were several different plazas and mound clusters, which suggests that the leadership was much less centralized than those at earlier Olmec centers. Not only that, far fewer exotic goods besides obsidian show up in the archaeological record. Greenstone was still trickling in from the highlands of Mexico and Guatemala, and mica was being imported from Oaxaca, but in much smaller amounts. The leaders at Tres Zapotes were clearly not able to monopolize economic and ideological sources of power and authority. This is looking pretty Bush League, but Tres Zapotes and Epi-Olmec sites do hold some interesting surprises. Tres Zapotes monuments may lack the scale and grandeur of their Olmec predecessors, but there's some very interesting pieces to note. Stele continued to depict historical and mythical scenes and themes. Monument C is a noteworthy example of late formative art. The scenes here are very ornate and full of action. If this is ringing a bell, it should be because this is very similar to the Azapan style we mentioned earlier, and it shows that Tres Zapotes was employing a very similar artistic style. Now, whether Tres Zapotes was copying Azapa or whether the two were borrowing from common heritage is a matter of debate, but it's interesting that this style appears at sites that had strong Olmec ties. Perhaps the most interesting feature of Epi-Olmec monuments are the presence of full-blown writing and calendar dates. We've seen plenty of earlier narrative scenes, but writing allowed history to be recorded and represented in an entirely new way. This script is referred to as Isthmian script, and it's found in the Western Olmen during the late formative. Another important aspect of this was the development of the long count. The Mesoamerican long count is a solar calendar that counts days from a mythological creation date of August 11th, 3114 BCE, and it was used by several pre-Columbian cultures, most notably by the Maya. Several examples of this in Epi-Olmec culture exist, but the most famous is Tres Zapotes' Stela C, not to be confused with Monument C that we just discussed. Stela C was excavated in 1939 by Matthew and Marion Sterling, and helped prove the antiquity of the Olmec because the stela has a long count date of 7/16/6/1618, or September 3rd, 32 BCE, which placed the Olmec far earlier in time than many scholars expected. The accompanying inscription is too eroded, but likely commemorated an important event at the site, likely an act by a ruler. Most Epi-Olmec inscriptions are fairly short, but there's one glorious exception that comes from the nearby site of La Mojara. Here, a 2-meter tall stela was discovered in 1986 with the image of a ruler in full regalia next to a long inscription that included two long count dates from 143 and 156 CE. When this stela was discovered, it stunned the archaeological world because it finally gave scholars a long text that they could attempt to decipher. And in the 1990s, John Judson and Terence Kaufman attempted to do just that. They assumed that the Epi-Olmec must have spoken a Proto-Mishezokian language and used that as the basis of their decipherment. After years of work, they published a proposed reading of the text. Most scholars, however, are skeptical of this decipherment. Stephen Houston and Michael Coe tested this by comparing their decipherment to another Epi-Olmec inscription held in a private collection, and it failed. So I think it's safe to say that Isthmian decipherment is still on the horizon. Actually, when I was writing this episode, a new book on Isthmian script was published by Martha J. Mockery. So if this topic really interests you, you can give that book a read. I haven't read it yet, but I hope I get the chance to someday. As cool as this development is, we shouldn't look at this in a vacuum, because this was part of a broader trend across Mesoamerica. Isthmian script was one of several mature writing systems that were popping up across Mesoamerica during the late formative period. This same period is also when the earliest Maya, Zapotec, and Izapan textual inscriptions first emerged. As I mentioned earlier, the Zapotecs have the earliest undisputed example of a calendar and name glyph. Other long count dates can be found outside the Olmen as well. The very oldest comes from Stela II at the Zokian site of Chiapa de Corso, which has a long count date of 7/16/3213, or December 6th, 36 BCE. Some scholars maintain that the Olmec are the progenitors of writing and had a big influence on Mesoamerican writing. These scholars will point out that some classic Maya glyphs have no semantic or phonological correspondence in Maya languages, and that they make much more sense in reconstructed Zokian languages. However, discoveries of other early scripts have cast a lot of doubt on this. It's entirely possible that the Epi-Olmec drew upon wider Mesoamerican developments when they created their script. This is something that's going to require more investigation to figure out. Epi-Olmec culture would eventually transition into classic Veracruz culture around 200 CE. This would be marked by new pottery styles and the emergence of new sites, but most people probably didn't notice a big difference and continued to live as their ancestors had, eating the same foods, living in the same houses, and praying to the same gods while paying taxes to new rulers. Some Epi-Olmec sites, such as Cerro de las Mesas, grew and persisted into the classic period. Outside of the Olmen, classic cultures like the classic Maya, Teotihuacan, and Zapotec culture would emerge out of the late formative period. Before we conclude this pair of episodes, let's take a moment to assess the legacy of the Olmec. As I mentioned way back at the beginning of the previous episode, Olmec culture is often called Mesoamerica's mother culture. Is that title actually fitting for the Olmec? There's a lot of debate about the Olmec legacy, so please understand that there are scholars, archaeologists, art historians, and well read Mesoamerican nerds who may disagree with my assessment, and that's fine. Let's look back at what we've covered to evaluate the impact of the Olmec on Mesoamerican culture. I'm going to start with some claims that I'm very skeptical of. In the past, the Olmec have been presented as Mesoamerica's first urban civilization that pioneered centralized leadership, intensive maize agriculture, long distance trade, writing, and the ball game. To quote the words of Michael Coe, the Olmec disseminated civilization itself, unknown before they appeared. Mesoamerica as we know it was really their creation. Very strong language there, and hopefully you'll understand why that is probably an overstatement. But let's dive in. As I mentioned in the previous episode, the Mokaya were already very centralized and building impressive settlements before the Olmec. Heck, the Mokaya elites were even making chocolate long before the Olmec ever tasted it. They were living the high life. Most scholars believe that other cultures in the formative period likely owed their growth and urban development to their own success rather than mimicking San Lorenzo and La Venta. We also know that these cultures were practicing maize agriculture, while San Lorenzo eschewed intensive agriculture in favor of a more mixed wetland strategy until its decline. When La Venta started investing in intensive agriculture, they were late to the party. Another thing that had already been occurring across Mesoamerica, even in archaic times, was long distance trade and exchange. Materials like obsidian and jade were already moving between distant communities when the Olmecs emerged. Now, the Olmecs certainly took that trade to new heights. They expanded these networks and traded with more societies in higher volume than had ever been seen before, particularly after the rise of La Venta. Remember the huge quantities of greenstone that La Venta imported for the ceremonies in Complex A. The Olmec's role in the creation of writing is harder to assess. If you believe the Cascajal block to be an example of Olmec writing, then I think you can make a case for an Olmec origin in writing. But as I said, many scholars, and I myself, are skeptical of this. A safer position, in my opinion, is that the Olmec appear to have been experimenting with writing and glyphs, but they weren't the only people in Mesoamerica that were doing that. At the same time as artifacts like the San Andres Seal and La Venta Monument 13 were made, the Zapotec were also employing written glyphs as well, so it's difficult to say if the Olmec took outside inspiration or invented this on their own. We know that Epi-Olmec culture did employ a script, but again, this appears at the same time that other scripts were appearing in Mesoamerica. Similarly, the earliest calendrical inscriptions appear in many areas of Mesoamerica at the same time, so it's difficult to ascribe the Mesoamerican long count to the Olmecs. Lastly, the Olmec likely played a role in popularizing the ball game, but it's uncertain if it was invented by the Olmec. While the earliest rubber balls are found at Almanatee, the Mocaia site of Paso de la Amada holds the record for the oldest ball court in Mesoamerica. I think it's fair to say that the Olmec may have lent it a lot of prestige, but the jury is still out on who exactly first invented it. It may sound like I'm trying to rain on the Olmec party, but that's not my goal here. I want to give a fair and realistic assessment of Olmec achievements, of which there are several. Mesoamerica owed the Olmec a great debt for the legacy that they left. We see this best when we look at Olmec ideology and art. The Olmec created a well developed ideology of rulership, one that was durable and expressed in high quality monumental art. Colossal heads, thrones, and stelae all proclaimed the powers of rulers and their ancestors. Later Olmec stelae even hint at divine connections that rulers had. Such art that emphasized royal power and authority were copied over a wide area of Mesoamerica. Chalcatzingo, Axtotitlan, and Teopantecuantitlan are great examples of this. The people who really ran with this were their Azapan and Maya neighbors. The Maya especially carried on the practice of celebrating accomplishments of their kings on stelae for centuries. In fact, these stelae are very important for archaeologists and historians in reconstructing Mesoamerican history. Olmec monumental art and ceremonial extravagance likely popularized a distinct iconography that provided many Mesoamerican cultures with a ready made visual repertoire that they could exploit or combine with their own motifs. There are many examples of elite pottery outside the Olmen that have Olmec motifs, despite the fact that many of these were made locally. These artisans were clearly taking inspiration from the Olmec. More overt religious iconography also proved to be very durable as well. I know I just said that the Olmec didn't pioneer maize agriculture, but they did create an influential iconography around maize that persisted long after their culture declined. You'll also recall Miguel Covarrubias's chart of Mesoamerican rain and water deities that he traced back to this Olmec water god. The feathered serpent appears all over Mesoamerica in later centuries, and the earliest depictions are among the Olmec. On a more grim note, one could also argue that human sacrifice also had its origins among the Olmec at Almanatee, but again, that evidence is open to interpretation. Judging from stingray spines discovered in tombs at La Venta, it's likely that bloodletting rituals were also being practiced by the Olmec, and this is something that occurred in later cultures as well. Now, it's impossible to say with certainty what political and religious ideas and values came with this ideology. Those are not easy to detect in archaeology, but I think a good case can be made that certain religious and political concepts accompanied the spread of Olmec art and ideology. For the cultures across Mesoamerica in contact with the Olmec, they could fashion these ideas, aesthetics, and values to suit their own desires and tastes. Again, this isn't to say that other cultures didn't have their own important and influential local traditions. Indeed, classic period cultures and civilizations were built on institutions and ideologies that developed all across Mesoamerica during the formative period, both at home and abroad. Even if the Olmec played an important role, they were far from the only players. I said this at the very beginning of the episode, but I think it bears repeating. I don't think that the Olmec should be thought of as the prodigious parents of high Mesoamerican culture. A better way to think of the Olmec may be as one of many precocious siblings, a sibling that left a particularly durable legacy in their family's memory long after they had departed. And that's going to wrap us up for today. Special thanks to my patrons listed here. You guys are the best. If you would like to join the ranks of these fine individuals and support the show, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the description. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and follow us on Facebook. Take care, and we'll see you in our next episode.